So welcome back, everybody. I included in your reading assignment for this week the preface that Henry James wrote on the occasion of revising his novel, The Portrait of a Lady, in 1908. Now, that would appear to suggest a kind of equal status or importance of that short essay with the first dozen or so chapters of James's novel, which, after all, is the main focus of this lecture, as it is of our study of Henry James. And usually prefaces to novels, whether they're written by the author or by someone else, are understood as introductions, commentaries, or afterthoughts even, that bear only indirectly on the text that follows it. It's not necessary at all to read a preface to understand the literary text, and more often than not, we tend to read them sometimes after we've read the text. So, we might think of this kind of writing as secondary or critical or even superfluous in relation to the higher quality of the novel itself. In some cases, we would be justified in those assumptions, but in the case of Henry James, we need to revisit those judgments. In the first case, while the preface tells us things about the novel that are important to know, it's also a distinguished and quite separate kind of writing from that novel. One way to look at it is to remember what Henry James says in the earlier essay we read called The Art of Fiction. There you'll recall his telling us that critical investigation and analysis of a literary work is as valuable a form of human creativity as is novel writing. In fact, the active production of literary criticism over certain periods of time and within certain cultures sometimes exhibits even greater forms of expression, thought, or insight, or imaginative creativity than the literature being produced at the time. Not all ages are ripe for the emergence of literary achievements, in which case the ferment of critical activity seeds the ground in such periods of dormancy. The idea comes straight out of Matthew Arnold's landmark essay from an earlier generation called The Function of Criticism at the Present Time. In James's case, both the preface and the novel are brilliant in their own way. The preface is important to understanding a number of things about James's novel, as well as about the place of James within the development of that modern genre. I'll talk about a few of the salient points to think about in the preface, including the continuities you may have noticed between the essay and The Art of Fiction that you read earlier, having to do with things like the artist's freedom, the obligation to render life truthfully as a kind of moral imperative, the comparison of the literary with the visual arts, and most importantly, James's understanding of his own experimentation with form and his related innovations in subject matter and point of view in novel writing. But what I'd like also to explain about the preface, before going on to discuss the novel, is how it belongs to a group of other prefaces that James wrote for his body of work in the late stages of his literary career. Together, these 18 prefaces that James wrote for the collected edition of his works form a unique body of literary criticism in and of themselves. Here, James had the opportunity to say of his work everything he had hoped critics had said about his work over the previous 40 years of his literary career. Compelling, idiosyncratic, stylistically intricate, the prefaces were unlike anything readers had read from Henry James up to that point, or from any writer for that matter. Each one of them takes us into the creative process in deeply personal and revealing ways, but part of their value lies in what James's early biographer Leon Adele describes this way. The novel in English had long been taken for granted as simple storytelling. James, arriving on the English scene late in the century, had taken the novel machine apart in a very American way, given it a technology it had not possessed, and like the Americans of the future, had practiced his craft strenuously and professionally, whereas most of his English confrères practiced it in a relaxed and spontaneous way, as something designed to add to the joy of life. James's joy lay in the skill he deployed, in the pride of his inventiveness. I would like to say a few words about what occasioned the writing of these often astonishing prefaces, which was James's decision to collect and revise his work into a definitive edition that is now generally known as the New York edition. Published by Scribner's in 23 volumes, the full title was The Novels and Tales of Henry James, New York edition. James spent 4 years preparing it, writing to the publisher that, and I'm quoting here, "I should particularly like to call it the New York edition, if that may pass for a general title of sufficient dignity and distinctness," adding that it refers to the whole enterprise explicitly to my native city, to which I have had no great opportunity of rendering that sort of homage. James, as you know, had lived most of his life in Europe, far from his family roots in New York and New England. But throughout his long absence, the United States had changed dramatically. The America James remembered was confined to the Northeast coast, but after the turn of the 20th century, it was a much vaster, more populous, diverse, and expansive country that bore very little relation to the country that James had known in his youth. When he turned 60 years of age, with nearly all of his major novels and tales already behind him, James turned to the writing of autobiography, reflection, and a newfound interest in the country and the people he had left behind so many decades earlier. In 1903, he decided to cross the Atlantic, presumably for the last time in his life. He would see his older brother, William James, and his family, visit Boston, Cambridge, and Newport once again. He would eventually make his way to Washington, D.C., dine with President Theodore Roosevelt, visit Florida and the Midwest, where he was hosted by the American writer Hamlin Garland in Chicago. He visited California. Everywhere he went, he gathered impressions. His arrival in America was reported in the press, which published cartoons about the great, difficult expatriate writer. And when James was in the United States, he tended to his literary business, consulting his American publishers and sending them proposals for a complete edition of his works. It was to be a capstone, a kind of monument to his career, and a shoring up of his reputation as an American writer that he hoped would also improve his financial profile. The most immediate result following his visit to the United States was a book he published called The American Scene, which revived his interest in nonfiction travel writing. After 20 years of living abroad, James wrote about the disappearance of the New York of his childhood, finding the modern city overly commercial, graceless, and socially heterogeneous. He writes about Concord, Massachusetts, and the legacy of American writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. In Richmond, Virginia, he contemplates the meaning of the Civil War. Published in 1907, the book would become an eloquent farewell address to the country in which he was born and to which he would never return. As James prepared the publication of his collected works, he revised the great bulk of his early fiction, including The Portrait of a Lady, to bring them up to the level of his mature style. He did not arrange them in chronological order, but grouped them according to theme and subject matter. and while a complete edition would easily have required 35 volumes, James set himself the limit of 23, leaving out 3 books set in America, including the novels Washington Square, The Europeans, and The Bostonians, all now considered minor masterpieces, which James deemed unsuitable for republication. Eventually, the edition would have to stretch to a 24th volume to accommodate the number of tales James included. But despite this unexpected increase, the edition as a whole retains its own unique architectural structure. As a part of the proposal to Scribners, James wrote the following request. Lastly, I desire to furnish each book, whether consisting of a single fiction or of several minor ones, with a freely colloquial and even perhaps, as I may say, confidential preface or introduction, representing in a manner the history of the work or the group, representing more particularly, perhaps, a frank critical talk about its subject, its origin, its place in the whole artistic chain, and embodying, in short, whatever of interest there may be to be said about it. I have never committed myself in print in any way, even so much as 3 lines to a newspaper, on the subject of anything I have written, and I feel I should come to this part of the business with a certain freshness of appetite and effect. At this point, I'll say a little bit about James's revisions regarding The Portrait of a Lady before moving on to the preface. The revisions he made to the novel are problematic mainly for textual editors. James worked with the Boston edition of 1882 and the 1-volume London edition of that same year while he was working on the revision. The net effect of his many alterations in the text that we're reading in this course is to enhance the novel by subtly and skillfully rewriting it to strengthen his characters and eliminate ambiguities in the earlier text. The later Isabel Archer is so altered, according to Leon Adele, quote, as to be almost a new personage, unquote. But the substance of the story is not changed, and James did not introduce any new scenes or incidents. A striking alteration was James's omission of 2 pages in the 29th chapter devoted to the nature of Gilbert Osmond and the egotism of his bachelorhood. For some 94 lines of early analysis of his character, James substituted 10 lines in which he simply tells the reader that Isabel had discerned Osmond's style and that this has a certain uniqueness. You'll note this happens to be more in keeping with James's intention of limiting the focus to Isabel's impressions and thought processes rather than those of other characters. Perhaps the most noticeable alteration James made to the portrait, besides tightening the coherence of point of view and symbolic imagery in the text, is the erotic dimension of Isabel's character. Just to give one example, consider this description of Caspar Goodwood's kiss in the closing paragraphs of the novel. In the first edition, James described the kiss in a single sentence. His kiss was like a flash of lightning. When it was dark again, she was free. In the New York edition, this becomes a paragraph that reads, his kiss was like white lightning, a flash that spread and spread again and stayed, and it was extraordinarily as if, while she took it, she felt each thing in his hard manhood that had least pleased her, each aggressive fact of his face, his figure, his presence, justified of its intense identity, and made one with this act of possession. She had heard of those wrecked and underwater following a train of images before they sink, but when darkness returned, she was free. The 2 editions of The Portrait of a Lady cannot, as many scholars concur, be adequately harmonized into a single definitive text. To do so would be to create yet another version of the novel. What we're left with, essentially, is an early edition that stands on its own unique merits that are distinct from those of the later edition. Hence, the New York edition of The Portrait of a Lady is a separate entity altogether. One other choice Henry James made, in agreement with his publisher Scribner's, was to include a pictorial frontispiece for each volume, an image that would capture something of the theme of that volume. For the two images selected for volumes 1 and 2 of The Portrait of a Lady, James turned to the modern art of photography, choosing the work of a young avant-garde photographer named Alvin Langdon Coburn. For the part of the novel that mainly features Isabel Archer's arrival in England, James chose a photograph of an English country house that captured what the author describes as a good, reproducible, slightly nebulous view of the English country house, Hardwick-on-the-Thames, which he had vaguely and approximately in mind years ago for the opening of his novel. On the left of your screen, you'll see the original photograph that was used as the frontispiece for Volume 1 of the New York edition of The Portrait of a Lady, and to the right is a modern-day photograph of that same estate called Hardwick Court. This is the model for Garden Court in the novel, and this is where, of course, Isabel first finds herself. It is both the most comfortable and the safest house that she will inhabit in the novel. James wanted to capture the Arcadian or ideal associations of this garden home, but also gives it a designation that speaks to Lord Warburton's courting of Isabel, as well as Caspar Goodwood's visit there to revive his courtship with her. The image is also a reminder not just of where the book begins, but also of where, in the end of the novel, Isabel returns after Ralph Touchett's final illness. For Volume 2 of the novel, James selected a photograph of a bridge in Venice, both to signify the shift in the setting from the island nation of England to continental Europe, not to mention the evocative symbolic association of bridges and transitions within the character of Isabel Archer, whose name incidentally echoes something of those architectural metaphors as well. Several different ideas and topics can be found in the preface that are worth thinking about. Here's a short list of them, and they include 1. The conception of a literary work as an organic arrangement. This means the process of its composition, as well as the way it captures an ongoing sense in the reader's mind of a living thing. Of course, that second aspect is harder to grasp than the first one, but we'll try in a moment to demonstrate what this means. Secondly, James talks about literary works as art forms like other art forms, and can be fruitfully produced and studied using similar criteria used to judge the aesthetic achievement of things like novels. Third, James provides us with a working, quasi-technical, critical vocabulary for talking about craft. Many of his concepts have since become part of critical discourse, again, adopted in some cases from other arts. 4. James's attention in the creative process to what he calls the deep well of unconscious cerebration, a nod to Freud, perhaps, before Freud, and an example of which includes James's account of writing The Portrait of a Lady, which includes periods of inaction and sudden revelations of the characters and settings to be used in the book. And last, James's experimental innovations of the conventional novel, which includes the choice of subject matter, the dispensing of traditional plots, and the manipulation of point of view. In a sense, James is offering a new definition of what novels are, what they can do artistically, which is a further elaboration of his theories in the art of fiction. Our goal here is not simply to tally up the set of points that James makes, but to observe and internalize the consequences that these ideas have in our reading of the novel. Taking the first point, then, let's just remind ourselves of what James means by organic form. And we can do this by looking at the imagery that the preface uses in phrases like the following: strangely fertilizing in the long run does a wasted effort of attention often prove. That's from page 4 in the Norton edition. Here's another one. These are the fascinations of the fabulist's art, these lurking forces of expansion, these necessities of upspringing in the seed, these beautiful determinations on the part of the idea entertained, to grow as tall as possible, to push into the light and the air, and thickly flower there. The immediate context of these images has to do with the unconscious processes of creativity that James gives weight to in conceiving of a novel. But what we should also notice is that such creative ferment is never produced in a vacuum, but it has to be instigated, prodded by conscious ideas, plans, articulations that initially have a tentative or inconclusive shape to them. Plans, that is, that depend upon a certain patient trust that they can eventually reach a satisfactory fullness of form. So the creative process James is talking about, and it's not entirely news, must by necessity be a dialectical one, inseparably linking the conscious and unconscious energies of literary production in an ongoing negotiation between essence and form. I'm stressing the dialectical aspect of literary production, or really for James any artistic production by any artist, so as to avoid a possible contradiction implied by that term organic. In other words, if we use the term, as I think James is using it in part, to describe a generative process, it's assumed to be an ongoing one. Organic in this sense implies evolving, changing, expanding, or contracting in ways resistant to the constraints of form. The unconscious can produce or overproduce any number of disconnected, associational, random images, but nothing inherent in that fertility can be said to have an aesthetic form, a conscious design, a deliberate pattern. It may lend itself to molding, but it is not the mold. But we use the term organic in another way as well. That is, to describe the nature of a form, the relations we perceive between its individual parts and its whole effect. This is yet another way James intends the meaning of organic, and it is consistent with his declaration in The Art of Fiction, where, as you will no doubt remember, he famously says this about the true craft of writing novels. I cannot imagine composition existing in a series of blocks, nor conceive in any novel worth discussing at all of a passage of description that is not in its intention narrative, a passage of dialogue that is not in its intention descriptive, a touch of truth of any sort that does not partake of the nature of incident, or an incident that derives its interest from any other source than the general and only source of the success of a work of art, that of being illustrative. A novel is a living thing, all one and continuous, like any other organism, and in proportion as it lives, will it be found, I think, that in each of its parts there is something of each of the other parts. I suspect we can all agree as to what this really means, namely that the aesthetic coherence, the thematic unity, the very meaning of the text would suffer, die a little, as it were, if one of its parts were removed, one of its characters missing, one of its settings incongruent with the other settings. But I'd also like to propose something less abstract than this, and something more literal. I want to tease out the fullest consequences of thinking about a book as a person, a living, breathing, moving person, whose form is determined only by the shifting of her consciousness, her impressions of those she meets, her decisions and her indecisions, her mistakes and resolutions. In a word, that flickering light we call Isabel Archer, whom we believe we know one moment and find utterly incomprehensible the next. Not unlike the complicated people we meet and live among in real life. Looked at this way, James's ostensibly reasonable discussion of organic composition reveals just how radical it is, just how profoundly reorienting its conclusions for readers are. In fact, James himself points us in this direction with his intervention in conventional novel writing by telling us in the preface that he did not begin writing the portrait of a lady with any plot in mind. Instead of mapping out a series of incidents, twists and turns and surprises into which the characters are placed to carry out the story, he began instead with, and I'm quoting here, the sense of a single character, the character and aspect of a particularly engaging young woman, to which all the usual elements of a subject, certainly of a setting, were to need to be superadded, unquote. He goes on to conceive of this young woman in the basic terms of an architectural structure, as he calls it, a single small cornerstone, the conception of a certain young woman affronting her destiny, and made to serve as the foundation of the large building he calls the portrait of a lady. It came, he tells us, to be a square and spacious house, or has at least seemed so to me in this going over it again. But such as it is, it had to be put up round my young woman while she stood there in perfect isolation. That is, to me, artistically speaking, the circumstance of interest, for I have lost myself once more, I confess, in the curiosity of analyzing the structure. By what process of logical accretion, James goes on to say, was this slight personality, the mere slim shade of an intelligent but presumptuous girl, to find itself endowed with the high attributes of a subject? Well, James is confronting head-on the challenge of making such a girl interesting to readers. With no extraordinary beauty or overpowering charm to distinguish her, Isabel Archer is not a heroine of romance in the old-fashioned sense. Nor does she face unusual challenges, the way Jane Eyre does, say, in Charlotte Bronte's great novel by that name. She's not saturated with the bloodless religious sentiments of Dorothea Brooke from George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, a book James admired tremendously. She doesn't suffer from boredom to the disastrous degree that Emma Bovary does in Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, nor does she embark on a bold love affair as the adulteress Anna Karenina does in Leo Tolstoy's novel. She has nothing of the hysterical passion Catherine Earnshaw exhibits in Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, when that character, say, throws herself into the open grave of Heathcliff. And yet James set out to write a great novel, the subject of which is a woman. How, though, to make, as James puts it, an ado about her? How does one lure the reader into both an interest in Isabel Archer, as well as the ennobling of a female character of the type whose stories usually go untold? James solves the problem, I think quite satisfactorily, in a couple of strategic ways that I'd like to talk about. Isabel is a character who, primarily, finds herself interesting. And, starting from there, the next trick, as it were, of inversion becomes all the more apparent for an experimental novelist like Henry James. I'll let him speak. There's always the escape from any close account of the weak agent of such spells by using as a bridge for evasion, for retreat and flight, the view of her relation to those surrounding her. Make it predominantly a view of their relation, and the trick is played. You give the general sense of her effect, and you give it, so far as the raising on it of a superstructure goes, with the maximum of ease. Well, I recall perfectly how little, in my now quite established connection, the maximum of ease appealed to me, and how I seemed to get rid of it by an honest transposition of the weights in the two scales. Place the center of the subject in the young woman's own consciousness, I said to myself, and you get as interesting and as beautiful a difficulty as you could wish. Stick to that for the center. Put the heaviest weight into that scale, which will be so largely the scale of her relation to herself. Make her only interested enough at the same time in the things that are not herself, and this relation needn't fear to be too limited. Place meanwhile in the other scale the lighter weight, which is usually the one that tips the balance of interest. Press least hard, in short, on the consciousness of your heroine's satellites, especially the male. Make it an interest contributive only to the greater one. See at all events what can be done in this way. You'll notice James's frequent use of that term interest in the preface. And that's a term that comes up again in the bantering dialogue exchanged between the three gentlemen that we first meet in the opening chapter of The Portrait of a Lady. We saw the concept of interest, though, in James's earlier defense of fiction, in that essay called The Art of Fiction, where he gives the idea the most elevated motive in the crafting of a novel. He thinks, in other words, that the interest generated is, in the subject matter, the most important element of a successful novel. So that's a very different way of talking about the word interest from the way we usually talk about it, the way we usually use that term in everyday speech. The vagueness with which people use this term in everyday speech belies the specificity with which James uses it in his writing. We tend to say anything at all can be interesting to us if it catches and holds our attention, even for a short time. In fact, the range of possibilities within that time frame is quite wide. And the intensity of our attention can go from total absorption to a barely acknowledged sign of interest. Sometimes we use the word to blanket over our actual lack of attention or unwillingness to pay more attention to something. Interesting, we say, in response to a friend's overly extended description of her cat's amusing antics that morning. It might be helpful to think of the analogy to interest's financial meanings when considering Henry James's use of the term. In this sense, interest represents a kind of excess value accrued by an investment someone makes. An investment must first be made in order for interest to be earned. In the case of finding a subject for an extended work of narrative fiction, the novelist must both invest in that subject's creation, but also ensure that readers will invest their time, their patience, and focused attention in reading that novel. The payoff for that investment is the interest earned, the profit taken from the pleasure that results from an exercise of the reader's imagination, empathy, and aesthetic appreciation of a well-formed object of art. Even before readers encounter the subject of the portrait of a lady, the three male figures prepare a kind of groundwork for Isabel's ability to attract our interest by bringing their conversation around to women. Ralph Touchett is the first to say, apropos of Lord Warburton's apparent world weariness, that by contrast, he's not the least bored. "I find life," says Ralph, "only too interesting." To which his father responds, "Ah, too interesting. You shouldn't allow it to be that, you know." This is relevant given that once the reader knows Ralph finds life interesting, his immediate interest in his newly arrived cousin Isabel validates and draws our interest to her. Daniel Touchett's casual response captures his son's susceptibility to finding Isabel too interesting, and sounds a mild note of concern and recognition of what will be Ralph's rather hapless investment in Isabel's life. Warburton even more explicitly sets the stage for Isabel's appearance when he says a few lines later, "I should like to see your idea of an interesting woman," ending the chapter with a kind of challenge in regard to the young woman he and we still have not yet met. He quips, "Perhaps, after all, she's not worth trying on." The word worth here is related to interest, of what an investment of attention is worth, say. And as the second chapter opens with Isabel standing in the doorway of Garden Court, observing these men before Ralph notices her, James has done a lot already to dispel the reader's skepticism of having this particular subject for this particular novel. As that second chapter ends, it's Warburton again who confirms the legitimacy and the power of that subject matter when he declares, and I'm quoting here, "You wished a while ago to see my idea of an interesting woman. There it is." You can see in this remark, as you can see when Ralph's first gesture in meeting his American cousin is to immediately give her his dog Bunchy, what James means by concentrating the focus of the novel on Isabel Archer as its center. We see, as readers, more of the effect she has upon other characters than what she thinks about them. And when she does think about them, these thoughts mostly have to do with how they impact her relationship with herself as a person in flux. There are other ways in which James controls the focus of the novel that have to do with its organic structure. That is, if we take James's notion seriously, that each element that goes into a novel reflects all of its other elements, something as routine as settings, descriptions, locations, and physical dimensions have to be taken into account as things that are saturated with the book's central human subject. Take, for example, the way the book begins. It may strike some readers as an odd way to introduce a novel about a lady, as the title suggests, since there is no lady until chapter 2, but we have already seen how the dialogue we read prepares us, rhetorically and thematically, for that subject matter, so it's not hard to see the same kind of thing at work in James's opening description of a house and a lawn. Let's look at that now and think about the passages that I've highlighted in this slide. Under certain circumstances, there are few hours in life more agreeable than the hour dedicated to the ceremony known as afternoon tea. There are circumstances in which, whether you partake of the tea or not, some people of course never do, the situation is in itself delightful. Those that I have in mind in beginning to unfold this simple history offered an admirable setting to an innocent pastime. The implements of the little feast had been disposed upon the lawn of an old English country house in what I should call the perfect middle of a splendid summer afternoon. Part of the afternoon had waned, but much of it was left, and what was left was of the finest and rarest quality. Real dusk would not arrive for many hours, but the flood of summer light had begun to ebb, the air had grown mellow, the shadows were long upon the smooth, dense turf. They lengthened slowly, however, and the scene expressed that sense of leisure still to come, which is perhaps the chief source of one's enjoyment of such a scene at such an hour. From 5 o'clock to 8 is on certain occasions, a little eternity. But on such an occasion as this, the interval could be only an eternity of pleasure. Were it not for James's use of the suggestive phrase, few hours in life, the particular time of day and season would not symbolically resonate in the way it does when we see the imagery that follows. That is, this moment in time is a moment in the lifespan of a young woman who is the subject of the novel. Isabel is, in a sense, here already in the framing of her time of life, her season of life, as it were, a life in its full, if ebbing youth, on the threshold of maturation, experience, transformation. She even physically appears in the next chapter on a threshold under a doorway that frames her figure, lingering there just long enough to form a kind of picture, a kind of momentary stillness that cannot be sustained for long. Hence the imagery of season and hour, the perfect middle of a splendid summer afternoon. But an intimation also of her fate immediately follows this, suggesting a kind of natural progression. Part of the afternoon had waned, but much of it was left, and what was left was of the finest and rarest quality. Real dusk, James goes on to write, would not arrive for many hours, but the flood of summer light had begun to ebb. The air had grown mellow. The shadows were long upon the smooth, dense turf. They lengthened slowly, however. Every detail works to contribute to the same overall effect, even the untrod lawn suggesting Isabel's inexperience and the comfortable shelter of Garden Court. Compared to her unexpected first meeting with Selina Merle later in Volume 1, the setting here provides a much more comfortable view of Isabel's life. It is the introduction of Selina Merle not just into the novel, but into Isabel's life, which will change the course of that life. So, when we first see Isabel encountering Madame Merle in the music room of Garden Court, and of course the music has lured Isabel in, almost as if it is the sound of a kind of siren. Isabel is watching the back of Madame Merle as she plays the piano, and the phrase goes this way about the description. The lady played in the same manner as before, softly and solemnly, and while she played, the shadows deepened in the room. The autumn twilight gathered in, and from her place Isabel could see the rain which had begun in earnest, washing the cold-looking lawn and the wind shaking the great trees. The symbolism of the scene ushers us into another season, as it were, of Isabel's life history. Now, this is very useful in reading a long novel like The Portrait of a Lady because it helps us become aware of the particular nature of James's artistry. Each element of the composition, as I said, feeding into an ever-enlarging, ever-intensifying aesthetic whole. James had specific terms for some of these elements that were drawn from the visual art of painting, as we may have seen before. Among these were three concepts that he referred to as scenic, pictorial, and foreshortening, and I might add one more, frame. A scene is always dramatic and involves characters interacting with each other in dialogue, very much like the scene in a stage play. This element of a novel intermixed with pictorial elements, like the one I just read, that are descriptive and internal to the narrative, as opposed to the narrator's commentary. Of course, these elements are not really separable from each other and are often subtly combined. It is their proportions that vary. For James, the pictorial parts of a novel are not limited to physical descriptions, landscapes, or interiors of places, although all of those are clearly pictorial. Just as we saw James expanding the concept of experience in the art of fiction, he also includes under the pictorial impressions that form in the character's mind following an engagement with other characters in dialogue or in a scene. These moments express and describe what the character is feeling or thinking, so they are not scenic so much as a picture of what was remembered, a picture that is being assembled after the engagement with another character. There are other compelling things about the preface as well, having to do with James's architectural metaphors, for instance, to explain his method of composition. But one in particular is worth mentioning in addition to that, and that has to do with how James describes Isabel Archer as a young woman who affronts her destiny. And the verb there, I think, is a little jarring. It's because it's not really what we expect in that phrase. If destiny means predetermined path, one might expect the phrase to read confronts her destiny, or some less willful action. But affronts suggests something more aggressive, more rebellious, even in the face of something that cannot really be changed. And this is the keynote, I think, to Isabel's character, suggesting perhaps a naive belief she has in freedom and the general benevolence of other people, even though her experience teaches her the contrary. And finally, she will come around to accepting the constraints on that idea of freedom. Now, incidentally, speaking of freedom, which I think is a huge theme in the novel and well worth discussing, James, of course, is associating that with an American outlook as opposed to European, say. Europeans have maybe a more jaded view of the capacities of human freedom. That's at least what it seems to be on the surface, and we'll certainly explore this more fully. But just to add a side note here to this aspect of Isabel's character, it sort of broaches the topic of James's general understanding of good and evil, freedom and constraint, or freedom and tyranny, if you will. Much of his work is, and this is sometimes blatant, sometimes hard to grasp, is about the abuse of other people, power differentials between people, struggles between people, a kind of rapaciousness on the part of some people who sort of, it's not quite a Jamesian analogy, feed on other people. And I just wanted to read to you a note left in a memoir by a young woman who served as Henry James's typist and secretary in his later years when his painful wrist condition prohibited him from handwriting his many letters, his fiction, etc. It's around 1890 this starts happening. So many of the later works, long as they are, were dictated to secretaries and typists, and then they would give him what they had produced at the end of the day, and he would spend much of the evening and early morning the next day editing and revising. So there's a certain kind of cadence and rhythm that you can begin detecting in the later stories and novels. And James himself admitted at one point that he composed as he was walking around his study around the typist, slowly, composed to the rhythm of this new thing called a typewriter. Click, 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 etc. Now, the young woman that I'm quoting from wrote a memoir about her years working with Henry James, and she says something very interesting, and I just wanted to read it to you. She says, when he walked out of the refuge of his study, speaking about James, obviously, and into the world, and looked around him, he saw a place of torment, where creatures of prey perpetually thrust their claws into the quivering flesh of doomed, defenseless children of light. His novels are a repeated exposure of this wickedness, a reiterated and passionate plea for the fullest freedom of development, unimperiled by reckless and barbarous stupidity. And I think that's a very powerful statement of one of the great themes of James's work, having to do with freedom, tyranny, good, evil, these sort of classic antagonistic forces. Now, let me end by talking about one of the most vivid architectural metaphors that James uses in the preface. And it goes this way. He says on page 6 in the Norton, "The house of fiction has, in short, not one window, but a million. A number of possible windows not to be reckoned, rather, every one of which has been pierced or is still pierceable in its vast front by the need of the individual vision and by the pressure of the individual will." And that, of course, comes after a whole series of architectural metaphors comparing the composition of the novel to the building of a large edifice. Now, so far, that metaphor seems to restate a similar kind of claim James makes about the choice of subject matter that novelists have access to in the essay, The Art of Fiction. Reality, James tells us there, is immense, and experiences are innumerable. Any number of them can take the place of a subject for a full novel. Every individual has their own unique access to these things, and the expression of their experiences will vary from one individual mind to another. Given the framing, as it were, of our circumstances of life, the cast of our minds, our interests, and sense of truth, we see the world in a way, obviously, that is shaped already. Our vision of it is analogous to looking through a particularly unique shaped frame or window, you might say. The window may be small or large, it may be clear or opaque, but the point is we are looking from the inside out, and the extent and quality of what we see is determined by the body we inhabit and the company we keep. You'll note this way of putting it is not entirely deterministic for James. The language he uses stresses things like the pressure of the individual will and possible windows, perhaps referring to the imagination. But just as interesting is another way to look at the metaphor as having something to do with the house of fiction. rather than the so-called house of the writer's mind who is producing that fiction. And when you shift the perspective from writers writing to readers reading, you begin to see James's growing fascination with the technical effects of manipulating, narrowing, or shaping the novel's point of view, usually by way of limiting it to, say, one character's idiosyncratic way of reporting and understanding what's happening to them. These apertures, James goes on to write, of dissimilar shape and size, hang so altogether over the human scene, that we might have expected of them a greater sameness of report than we find. They are but windows at the best, mere holes in a dead wall, disconnected, perched aloft. They are not hinged doors, opening straight upon life. But they have this mark of their own, that at each of them stands a figure with a pair of eyes, or at least with a field glass, which forms again and again for observation a unique instrument, ensuring to the person making use of it an impression distinct from any other. He and his neighbors are watching the same show, but one seeing more where the other sees less, one seeing black where the other sees white, one seeing big where the other sees small, one seeing coarse where the other sees fine, and so on and so on. That's on pages 6 and 7. Again, the figure standing by the window and looking out at the world appears to be a number of things. Any individual looking at the world and experiencing their own perceptions of reality, any reader of a novel finding and seeing just those things in it that strike one's interest, or the novelist who selects and presents the subject matter of his work. One might also add to this list a character in a novel, a center of consciousness, as James would call it, through whose limited perspective we, the reader, receives knowledge and impressions of the fictional world. The complexity that arises, of course, is how these various windows or frames overlap each other in ways that, for James, unlocked creative potential in the field of fiction writing. As James concludes the window metaphor, he offers us the meaning of his analogy. Quote, "The spreading field, the human scene, is the choice of subject. The pierced aperture, either broad or balconied or slit-like and low-browed, is the literary form. But they are, singly and together, as nothing without the posted presence of the watcher, without, in other words, the consciousness of the artist. Tell me what the artist is, and I will tell you of what he has been conscious. Thereby I shall express to you at once his boundless freedom and his moral reference." Again, this last reference is to the artist's morality, and it echoes what James has to say about this aspect of the novelist's responsibilities with regard to instruction from the art of fiction, that is, the artist's field of work and the kinds of aesthetic issues he or she must address to produce a work of art are completely outside the ethical realm of moral questions of good and bad behavior, of right and wrong, for instance. The only standard the novelist should be held to in this context, then, is a purely aesthetic mastery of the sense of true life. And this is an idea that we will test against our reading of the first volume of The Portrait of a Lady when I see you soon.